Okay, we are here with the Mozart of anxiety doctors. That's my phrase that I call for him. He is the greatest of all time. Maybe the Muhammad Ali of OCD and anxiety, Dr. Stephen Phillipson. He has graced us. This is going to be jam-packed with value, y'all. He has graced us.
I'm ready to rope a dope, you know.
Rope-a-dope. Oh, my gosh. The bad dad jokes have already started. I like to call him Doc. He's the greatest. He's helped us so many times, and he's been with us and graced us with his time, his much valued time. He'd probably rather be sailing right now. Welcome, Dr. Stephen Phillipson. I need an applause.
Good to see you again, Nez.
Okay, Doc. So we've covered a lot. This is our fourth long form interview, and obviously links to all his amazing articles and the video clips that answer very specific questions will all be in the pinned comment, show notes, and description. Doc, the last time that we talked about, so much. And what I thought was so interesting is the term and concept of depression, something I felt a lot, and something related to anxiety that I don't even know if I could classify as depression. Deflated is a word I use a lot because relapses are very deflating, especially when you think you're okay and you've done the treatment and you've done the hard work and it suddenly comes back. Talk to us a little bit about what you meant when you said, Nez, I think the next time we talk, we should talk about depression in its relation to OCD and anxiety.
Sure. By the way, write down in your little notepad the term relapse, because that's also a hugely important concept in the treatment of OCD and then the potential retreatment of OCD. So it's a very, very critical part of, the huge part of our treatment is called, relapse prevention. But, relapse will occur because OCD is founded obviously on a biochemical emotional signal in the brain that sometimes once again throws a spanner, kind of starts malfunctioning and then generates these distressing emotional signals. Anyway, one of the 6 most pervasive distressing emotional signals is depression. And I just want to quickly mention the 6 most common emotional elements of OCD. Obviously, anxiety is the number 1 associated emotional element of OCD. And I would say that probably makes up about 60 to 70% of the cases are driven by the anxiety response. Number 2 in line, and the number 2 and 3 actually are very, very closely aligned. And those 2 emotions are guilt and shame. They are very, very common emotional signals that accompany many of the creative associations or intrusive thoughts, with the condition. Number 4 would probably be depression, which we'll talk about in depth in detail. Number 5 is anger. OCD can actually push an anger button emotionally. And number 6, and this is an emotion that has a tremendous amount of ramifications in representing certain personality challenges, and that 6th emotion is disgust, which we can get into and discuss at a separate time. So let's talk about depression within OCD. So first of all, depression as a unique diagnosis is a condition in which a person is generally manipulated by what we as cognitive behavioral psychologists consider to be irrational thoughts. And they usually involve what we call sort of the holy trinity of depressive thoughts, which are, I am a horrible, inadequate person, worthless, I'm a failure. Number 2 is my future is bleak and probably going to be meaningless. My future is going to represent continued failure, and my prospects for changing my future are limited because I see myself as a very inadequate, very inept, very incapable entity. And, along with that, people often just see the world around them also in a very, very negative light. So depression is something that cognitive behavior therapy was actually founded on in the 1970s as really the first treatment that beat medication in terms of effectiveness. Medication in the 80s was somewhat effective in alleviating depression, but when people engaged in cognitive behavioral principles, they found a more robust, more powerful treatment effect. And you have also a much more enduring effect, because if you go off medication, the depression will reformat, because a person's schema, a person's way of looking at themselves and the world around them and their future, just goes right back to what they originally kind of have been living with. But with cognitive behavioral therapy, a person learns a skill base in recognizing irrational thoughts, and can, through their own cognitive efforts and cognitive discipline, basically ameliorate or remove themselves from the distress and the pain of depressive, irrational thoughts. So depression exists as a very separate diagnosis from OCD. And many people who have OCD are also depressed. But now when a person's depression is a subset of OCD, it's for very particular reasons. People with OCD often engage in a tremendous amount of avoidance in their life, because they're spending an amazing amount of priority to avoid things that might trigger anxiety. And so as a person, engages more and more in ritualizing and in avoidance, the quality and balance of their life becomes limited and starts to shrink. And where a person's balance is thrown off, it's very, very difficult to not be depressed. And that balance can include, obviously, things like unemployment. Many people, whose jobs evoke OCD responses, will often be told by, thoughtful physicians or even other mental health professionals, oh, since your job is making you anxious, you may want to take a leave of absence.
Wow.
And that's always the last thing that I recommend.
I can't believe that, Doc. That's crazy.
Well, it's just ignorance, which is the reason that I write and appear for free, on media, is to really kind of create a enlightenment about the condition, and really, cutting edge knowledge about the understanding of it and the treatment of it. So obviously, when people become unemployed, to me, there is very few forms of mental illness that are more painful than unemployment. I think about a person who, where the weekend is not distinguished from a weekday, and there's no sense of productivity or structure. It's extremely damaging to a person's emotional well-being. The number two most common balance in life that people with OCD sacrifice are relationships. And so, whether it be, romantic relationships that might spawn some anxious associations in terms of possible thoughts about violence or thoughts about shame. And, many of my patients say things like, who would want to date me while having OCD? And that's one of the most painful things that I hear on a bit of a regular basis, because, as I think we can agree, all humans carry a wide array of mental health challenges. No one, as I say in my choice article, escapes the mud hole in which we're all mentally challenged. We all are imperfect and defective and have moments of weakness. But people with OCD tend to carry a tremendous amount of shame and a sense of inadequacy because of their collaborating with their irrational brain. So when a person's life becomes limited because they have OCD, This is called a secondary depression because it's the result of a person's mismanagement of an anxiety disorder. And what the good news is, when a person's OCD treatment is successful and they create a rebalanced life, this depression naturally fades because they've restored that balance. So the third subset of depression that comes with OCD is just basically a sort of, it's an emotional response to a spike. And what's really interesting is that people will get a spike about being a very inadequate person, and with that association will come a depressive experience. So if I have a thought of harming a child, my brain might say to me, oh, what a horrible person you are for having that thought, and then accompanying that thought will often be just an emotional pairing of a depressed mood with that thought. And it's important to keep in mind that when people have a depressed mood association, that's very, very different than depression. Because when a person has a depressed spike association, meaning the thought is accompanied with a depressive experience, they feel very inspired to undo or escape that emotional distress signal. And that's really what distinguishes depression for an OCD spike of depression. Because when people are depressed and they have a thought about being inadequate, they actually just substantiate it and endorse the idea of its legitimacy. Whereas with an OCD spike of depression, they feel very energized to work their way out of that being a valid association.
So that's interesting that you say that. So it's somebody, are you saying, Doc, that somebody who's clinically, the distinction, somebody who's clinically depressed, it's such an all-consuming condition that the motivation to, like you said, work your way out of it is not there, versus an OCD depressive tendency, they are motivated to try to get out of this and work their way through it. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. The thing about OCD is spikes, are accompanied by these 6 emotions, but along with those 6 emotions is an inherent desperation to escape, or undo. So a person who has the thought, of harming their child, and they think, oh, I'm a horrible person for having that thought, they will then, let's say, ask a spouse to accompany them around their children because they're trying to escape having that thought. Or they'll ask their spouse or a family member, most often a mother, hey, I had this thought. Do you think that I'm capable of actually doing something like that? And so they're desperate to undo the association with an OCD component versus a depressive component. So a third element where depression falls into anxiety, and this is very, very interesting. When a patient actually stops ritualizing, it's very common that the brain will produce a depressive experience, because according to the brain creates an illusion that you're in a crisis. So, a person who, let's say, has an association of maybe God doesn't love them, or maybe they're committing sins against God. And so rather than engaging in ritualizing to reestablish a sense of faith in God's love, if they're engaged aggressively in therapy, a patient will stop seeking relief from that association. And in that regard, they're doing the therapy correctly. But it's not at all uncommon that a depressed mood will roll in because the brain perceives the absence of an effort to escape the problem as conceding to the problem being substantive. Meaning, it's like someone who has OCD about skin cancer, and they go to many, many dermatologists to find out you don't have skin cancer, you don't have skin cancer. So when a patient says, okay, I'm going to now treat this with behavioral principles and not seek reassurance, the brain reacts as if they're basically consigning themselves to death because they're not proving that they don't have skin cancer. So the brain says, well, you might have skin cancer and you're not going to seek relief from that possibility. And then there's this depressive, kind of experience of like defeatism. The brain reacts often to non-ritualizing as if a person has resigned themselves to suicide.
It's like your brain saying, you're giving up. Look at what a loser you are.
You're giving up, and now you're facing death, because the emotional signal of OCD is one that has a catastrophic, component that is trying to save a person from death based on an emotional signal rather than based on actual threat.
So it's like this really, this is why I have so much empathy, Doc, for people who have anxiety disorders, not just OCD. It really is a debilitating, it can be a very dark cycle that just repeats ad infinitum if not addressed. Wow. That is, would you say, so Doc, having said all that, and thank you. By the way,
you noticed, Nez, but OCD is considered the most painful psychological condition a person can have.
I can't doubt. Find me one that's more painful. I can't find. I would absolutely agree with that 1,000,000,000%. As somebody who's going through this and gone through this multiple times for 30 years, and functioned with it, I can absolutely co-sign that 1,000,000,000%. I wanted to. The first thing I thought about when you were mentioning the depressive characteristics of this specific ritualizing and thoughts was the fallacies that we did in our previous interview, the top fallacies of OCD. And one of those fallacies was, just because you have this doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or that you're weak. Now that you've laid that out so informatively, Doc, it seems to me, and I think I've said this before, that the Choice article and the concepts in that, and in the concepts of ERP and the concepts of communicating irrelevance to the broken amygdala, because the broken amygdala does not respond to words or logic. How would one approach this? What are some practical tools? Or is it the same thing? Is it just, how you can, let's say, work your way out of these depressive qualities that are attached to OCD and anxiety is to communicate irrelevance? Or what would you say are some tools to overcome this?
Yeah. I just want to expound on the depressive aspects of OCD.
Please.
Because, people with OCD can be extremely intelligent and extremely rational, obviously present company excluded.
I knew you were going to do it. I knew you just couldn't help yourself.
Low-hanging fruit. I had to do it. But the funny thing is, you see, with OCD, the harder you try to escape it, the further into the maze you go. And that's very depressing, because one of the core components of depression is a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. Mm-hmm. And so you've got this intelligent person that can be very successful in life, and they're trying desperately to shut off the disorder and escape from it by ritualizing. And it just gets them into more trouble, and it actually expounds the nature and pervasiveness of the condition. Mm-hmm. And so it's extremely demoralizing to know that, people who get themselves out of all kinds of trouble and have tremendous resources to navigate life very effectively, and with OCD, they're completely rendered helpless, because they don't know that the treatment of OCD is kind of like that Chinese handcuff, where the harder you try to pull out, the tighter it gets. And they can't figure out that to release yourself from OCD, you have to go into the fire rather than trying to escape it.
And you said it before we hit record, Doc, that the treatment of this condition is pregnant with paradoxes.
That's tremendously true. Yes, a lot of paradoxes with OCD. I often use the analogy, if you want to get a 3-year-old to stop throwing a tantrum and crying, you don't A, give them the candy, or B, tell them to shut up. You tell them to yell louder.
Wow.
And that diffuses the kid's power.
Wow.
And OCD is a lot like that, because it's very difficult to comprehend, but the intelligence of OCD has no more intelligence than a 2-year-old because it's pure emotion. There's no vocal capabilities. There's no logic or reason. So managing a 2-year-old is all about reward and punishment contingencies to shape their behavior. It has very little to do with talking to them because they often have a very limited vocabulary.
I remember you saying, or at least I thought that your choice article, which by the way, that'll be linked below for everybody watching and listening. I always said that this is why I've read it so many times. I guarantee you, Doc, nobody's read the choice article more than I have. Have you gotten comments of people who've read it like 1,000 times?
Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but one person actually this week said one of the nicest things to me. He said he thinks every human should read the choice article once.
I do too.
Yeah, because it's
I
not
do too.
about OCD. The choice article is really about a kind of a template for living life, and managing OCD or managing therapy in general is just one of the primary themes of the article.
I think it's a blueprint for being a human being. And when I say that, I'm not saying this is how everybody should be. I'm saying it's an option of a way to really live your life, as you say, centered and at peace. And I think that's what all human beings want. Most of your literature has been very utility in my perspective. X is the problem, Y, Z is the answer or solution or offering, if you will, because I know you don't like to say you help people, even though you do. So the choice article, I felt like it is your magnum opus. It went deeper than anything I've ever read from you or heard from you or digested from you in your talks, interviews, etc. And so relating it to what you just said about depression, Doc, would the precepts of the choice article, and I think this is a great segue into the next concept or next question I wanted to address. Symptom relief is not the goal. The goal is irrelevance, which is something that is mentioned predominant in the choice article and in your talks. Having said everything you said about these depressive qualities of OCD and anxiety, would that be another way of working your way through it, so to speak?
Yeah, it's interesting. Behaving.
In other words, I don't mean to cut you off, but in other words, I feel like the choice article is an answer to all of anxiety conditions. Maybe I'm wrong.
What?
Is an answer to all anxiety problems.
Oh, it's really, I think, a response or a guide for many, many mental health challenges.
Yes.
But you said, by the way, most people want to find peace in life. And I disagree. Unfortunately, I think most people have a very irrational goal. They say things like, I want to be happy. And, I think that is a huge mistake, which at some point in the future we can get into, because that's a very...
You talk about that in the article, by the way.
Yeah. Happy is not a goal. It's a byproduct. Like,
right.
Treatment effectiveness with OCD, the relief of anxiety or the diminishment of the brain's associations is not the goal. I say emphatically that research shows very clearly that all humans tend to have brains that produce what might be considered intrusive thoughts. I haven't had OCD for a minute in my life, and I have an incredibly, if you're going to judge things, I have a very evil brain voice. That's not Steve's chosen perspective, but the way my brain associates to many, many things has a very, very dark side to it. And, I don't have any judgment about that brain activity because it's basically spewing ideas to me as a machine that was really without consciousness, without guilt, or without editing. It's just, generates associations that the brain sees as being potentially relevant. And then the gatekeeper gets to look at those ideas and make decisions about how they're going to relate to them. But, going back to the premise, where patients will say, I'm working with you, in therapy, and you're telling me that the goal is not to feel better.
Yeah.
Why am I coming here?
Right. Why am I paying you all this money? I'm sure you get that, right, Doc, all the time?
No, it's not often. You would be surprised.
Oh, really?
Not really as often as I sort of used to.
Well, good.
Because most people, have read quite a bit about, the principles of the therapy in my writings, and they would know better than to say, why aren't I feeling better?
Oh, fantastic.
But unfortunately, they don't say that, but most of them are still kind of living that. And that's a huge part of the problem. The idea is, the anxiety and the thoughts within the world of OCD are what are referred to as variables within an independent system. And independent systems, as we've gone over a little bit, are ways in which our body functions that we absolutely have no control over. We can influence these things, but absolutely we cannot control them. So, if a bully, says, if you don't give me your lunch money, I'm going to punch you in the nose. If you keep giving them your lunch money, well, guess what's going to happen tomorrow? Basically the same thing. But if you say to the bully, hey, you know what? Today I'll take the punch in the nose. I'm not giving you my lunch money. So we're not controlling the bully, but there's a chance if you change the paradigm and you say to the bully, today's the punch in the nose day, you're not getting my lunch money, there's a greater chance that the bully will back down and find someone else to intimidate once you demonstrate that you're no longer going to be a victim. And I think that analogy is critical to understanding and to the treatment of OCD. That what we're doing in the treatment is we're showing the brain machine, and it's the brain machine that's broken here. People with OCD are extremely rational. I don't see them in any way as having mental illness, because just because their amygdala has a teeny little imbalance, which can send a very enormous emotional signal of crisis that is completely an illusion and a mirage. That's just all that's going on here. But obviously, when people are influenced by the completely authentic nature of that crisis signal, and there's no dispute that you feel like you're about to be bitten by a cobra snake. And so it's very difficult in that moment to say to the snake, bite me, rather than I'm going to run, or kill the snake. But so OCD is an independent system, both in the emotional component and in the thought component. People can't stop their brain from producing these, what might be seen as negative associations. I do prefer to call them creative associations, because to judge brain activity, it sort of embeds a label association of negativity. And the brain, when we present it with negativity, the brain is designed to solve negativity. So when we show the brain through aggressive exposure therapy, by touching a toilet seat and then eating a pretzel, we're showing the brain that not that, oh, look, we don't get sick, which is what a lot of people think, that we're teaching the brain that you don't get sick from touching toilet seats and eating pretzels. We're showing the brain that its signal, both of the threat of getting AIDS and the emotional signal, are irrelevant. One of my patients many, many years ago, and I love this quote, he said, when you can, rub your hands on a toilet seat and eat a sandwich with your hands, he said, it's really easy to pick up a pen off the floor. Meaning that at that level of exposure, very few things in our natural world become challenges after we've demonstrated to the brain that this risk of toilet seat germs is no longer going to be considered problematic or something to avoid.
I think most people, Doc, including myself, measure the success of getting a handle on their OCD. They measure that by the frequency of the disturbing, distressing thoughts or compulsions. So if I go through a day and I go, wow, I went to the beach with my family today, or whatever, or I worked on a project, I didn't have one single intrusive thought that I usually have, which is accompanied by an emotional tornado, I didn't have that. I must be doing it right. Correct me if I'm wrong, Doc, but you're saying that that's the wrong approach. That the approach is let the tornado come. Let the intrusive thoughts come. Demonstrate irrelevance by continuing on your task, continuing enjoying time with your family, and do that and ask for more.
Yeah, no, what you're saying is one of the greatest fallacies in the treatment of OCD, and unfortunately, something that contributes to the greatest degree of setback and basically delaying of the recovery effect. If you were at the beach and you were engaged in therapy because your OCD was enough of a burden that you wanted to behave in a way to show your brain that its challenges were no longer going to be impactful, I would tell you to bring your phone with you, to set an alarm on the hour. When the alarm goes off, look at one of your kids and say, I think I'm going to drown them today. When they come into the ocean with me, I think I'm going to pull them underwater and I'm going to drown them, because that's what kind of a horrible person I am. By you mimicking your brain's voice, by you reproducing the associations with not only willingness to have the thought, but also to be able to say to the brain, okay, brain, I just mimicked your associations, and I'm not going to call them bad, your creative associations, and now I'm ready for you to send me that emotional signal. Often, you talk about the paradox, the brain will not send the emotional signal. I call exposure therapy a lot like trying to tickle yourself. If someone else is tickling you, it can be very funny and you can laugh. But if you tickle yourself, we tend not to find it too funny. And so, and a lot of patients will say to me, oh, I must not be doing exposure therapy right because I'm not getting anxious. And I'll say to them, you're not supposed to get anxious. The goal is to be open to the possibility of getting anxious. And when you welcome the potential for anxiety, paradox, the brain will often not deliver that signal, because the brain's effort at giving anxiety is nothing more than a warning. Hey, you might be in trouble. I'm trying to warn you about this problem. And also keep in mind, and this is another huge fallacy of OCD, the brain isn't trying to poop on your beach parade day. The brain is sending you these signals because it actually wants you to clear them so that you can have a more perfect beach day. It's like a crazy best friend that has to keep warning you of stuff that's completely irrelevant and nonsense, but your crazy best friend thinks you really need to be warned about this. And that's what your brain is doing. It's just sending you warnings. So the more that you welcome your brain's warnings and produce them voluntarily, the more that the brain learns that its signals are irrelevant. And so if you go the whole day, and at the end of the day, you say, wow, I haven't had any thoughts, the worst thing to do is say, I must be doing something right. Actually, you got it completely 180 wrong. The best thing to say is, hey, brain, where you been? Well, I miss you. So I'm going to produce them to show you that how okay it would be for them to come. Wow. Now, when you have that mindset, and I tell this to patients all the time, where the presence of the associations cognitively, the presence of the associations emotionally are equal in terms of relevance to their absence. When you have that weighted system, you will no longer have OCD, because the brain recognizes as a machine that its signals will be meaningless to you.
It's usually the opposite. Like when and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, when I go through a whole day and I'm like, oh, hey, I haven't had to deal with this today, I must be getting better. Immediately the spike will hit and I'll immediately go into, oh, crap. When you're saying do the opposite, be like, hey, where you been, brain? What, are you lazy? Come on, man. You almost deal with it in an irreverent way, sarcastically. It almost has that, like you said, that counter effect. It's interesting.
Yeah. When I first started in my learning about OCD, my training, I used to take the train in to commute every morning. And when I'd be on the train platform, just as the train was coming into the station, my brain would tell me to jump in front of it. Now, I don't have OCD, so, I didn't get anxious at that thought. It was just a little bit annoying, and I would feel a little bit sort of heebie-jeebie-ish for about 2 seconds. And so what I decided to do was run an experiment. And so I decided I was going to have a race. And so when the train was coming into the station, I was going to beat my brain to the thought. And so I'd be like, I'm going to jump now. And I would just say that to my brain, and my brain would be radio silent. And within a month, it completely stopped sending me the associations.
Before OCD was activated in me, Doc, and I wonder if patients have said this to you. I remember having crazy, weird, out of the blue thoughts. I remember even vividly one time I was driving and imagining just veering my car. This is when I was a teenager, and just veering the steering wheel into oncoming traffic. And I would laugh at the thought. This is before the OCD was activated. This is like before the anxiety and the emotional signal and all that. And it was, why is this happening? I didn't have any of that. I was so easily able to dismiss it. So it's almost like living proof of what you say, that it's just a malfunctioning amygdala. Most people have these thoughts.
Yeah, like almost 99%, and 1%
Right.
is about it. I mean,
You used to say that you had a video of your dogs being shot that would play in your head.
Oh yeah, me shooting them actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. It hasn't.
And you
come
even
up-
said if it happened tomorrow, I'd be like, okay, whatever.
Yeah. I haven't had it occur recently, but totally, I would not have a problem if my brain produced that video at, later today when I'm going to be with the little pups.
Would you now? You said something interesting. The brain voice. I want to talk about that for a second. You've had patients say, "Well, I say, hey, I'm going to go drown my kid, and because I'm a bad person, I try to mock or whatever, but I don't believe it." Can you expound on that a little bit? This idea of the brain voice, people not understanding. Yeah.
More would be that a person might say, well, let's talk about one of the most common
Please.
effects of OCD, which is a sense of inadequacy.
Yes.
And also, a sense of inadequacy is also one of the largest contributors to depression. So, I talk to people about, just being human and accepting within their humanness, rather than, giving them or anyone else a label, just accepting that within being human, we have brains that produce these associations, and that the brain, let's say it has an association of violence toward your own child, and then the brain says, what kind of horrible person, would have a thought like that? So, one of the ways in which you can, kind of create a little bit of immunity to the victimization of that secondary, association of, like, not only am I having a harmful thought about a child, but I'm also now having a self-defeating thought about my adequacy and worth. And so I often talk to patients about, a cognitive behavioral perspective that rejects the concepts of any labels for any people. And so, when I first started implementing this perspective in my own life, because my brain had a lot of very dark things to say about me, sweet little innocent guy that I am, but but my brain had a lot of ammunition, for the first 26 years of my life to communicate a lot of dark associations about what kind of a person I was. And so when I would first say, hey, you know what, brain, I'm human, and I reject the premise of any label for me or any other human, my brain would say, that's nonsense. Obviously, there are such things as bad people. You obviously are one. There's tons of evidence for it. And so, here's where these two systems, these two voices, are really at odds to one another. And, I grew up believing that my brain voice was the deep, dark inner truth of Steve's perspective, and that the things that I would say to it were not having the impact. So if I said I'm human, my brain would say, that's nonsense. That's just a stupid excuse to not face what a horrible person you are. And so, I chose to, on faith, accept my humanness and accept that all humans are equal in their humanness. And so And boy, oh boy, this is not a very common belief, Nez. And most people are going to right now say, Steve's, pie in the sky nonsense philosophy here, because everyone knows that Adolf Hitler was a bad guy,
Right.
and all the Democrats know that Trump is a Nazi and a Hitler, mimic, and so most people are absolutely refuse to believe that there aren't qualified labels for humans, such as good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is, if you believe that there are such things as good or bad people, the way our brain is designed is going to be to find evidence that proves that we're bad people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why would our brain do that? I think it's a caveman survival instinct to say that the brain is designed to pick on our flaws and weaknesses so that we can enhance, our life, so we can improve things. And the brain, I talk to people about, like, Mr. Caveman may be great at picking up cave chicks, but not really good at throwing a spear and getting food. So his brain's just like, sure, anyone could pick up a cave chick, but you're never going to be able to feed your family, you clumsy idiot. And
Right.
the other Mr. Caveman, who's great at killing deer but can't pick up cave chicks, the brain would say, sure, you can have all the food in the world, but what is it worthwhile, since you're not going to have a cave chick and a cave family? And so the brain, really tends to pick on our deficiencies and create a very biased conclusion about our overall identity. So for me, as a human, I can say, hey, I spell on a third grade level. So if you saw my spelling, you'd think I was a complete idiot. And I'm completely at peace that I'm dyslexic. And there's a part of my brain that's very broken. I asked you the meaning of two words that you used earlier today. And you would think that with a PhD, those words wouldn't have gone over my head. But being dyslexic, I have a bit of a limited vocabulary, and I just accept that's one of my flaws as a human being, is I can't spell word beans, and my vocabulary is damaged because, being dyslexic, reading is torture for me. So the point is that all of us have these variabilities in our life. But if we own the belief that the vast majority of humans do, that there are good or bad people, our brain will put that mirror on ourselves, and it will most often find a negative conclusion. And so when we try to talk to people about choosing human over labels, they'll say, yeah, I say it, but I don't believe it. And when I hear someone say that, I know that they're making the same mistake, that they're trying to rewrite their brain voice. And it's really difficult to understand, as we made the point before. Our perspective is our choice. It's not something that's dependent on the brain voice saying, okay, I agree now, you've convinced me, Adolf Hitler was just human and not a bad person. There are very few people who really will swallow that pill, and that's the red pill, by the way. But unfortunately, because they don't swallow the red pill of being human, they suffer tremendous, sense of inadequacy because of it.
Yeah, I was just, it's interesting because you said I was looking at your article while you were at the tail end of that, and I was thinking to myself, isn't that the same thing, Doc, as trying to argue and add logic to this automatic, mechanistic, maybe reptilian brain that doesn't function? Isn't that the same thing? Like or am I wrong? Like, you're trying to out-logic it. You're trying to explain, like, well, wait a minute. No, I'm not. And it's like you're arguing with something that it can't argue back and doesn't understand.
So it's interesting because you can do cognitive behavioral therapy with depression or low self-esteem if a person actually has it. But if a person's spike theme is inadequacy, then you can't change the brain from continuously saying, you had the thought of harming your child, obviously you're a horrible person. That's just part of the spike. You can be dismissive of it, but you can't rewrite that. When it comes to, kind of what's called rational restructuring. So if my brain, if I stub my toe and my brain says, you clumsy idiot, Steve can immediately respond to that by saying, hey, I'm human, humans stub their toe, and I don't really believe I'm a clumsy person or an idiot. I'm an idiot in some ways and occasionally clumsy, but that's just once again part of my variability as a human. So it's really an important distinction because a lot of people try to use cognitive behavioral principles with OCD, and that's a tremendous waste of time. The treatment for OCD, which is effective, is behavioral therapy rather than cognitive behavioral therapy. And most people are going to be very, very confused by that because they don't understand that in cognitive behavioral therapy, you're using rational thinking to try to tame OCD, and that will never work because OCD is not a rational disorder. But depression can be effectively treated because depression is a disorder based on irrational beliefs.
Doesn't it all start in the head, Doc? Depression, anxiety, OCD. Isn't it all just taking thoughts too seriously?
Different parts of the head, Nez. OCD takes part in the amygdala, which has no language skills, whereas depression takes part in our neocortex, was the outer portion of our brain, and that's where all of our thinking takes place.
Okay.
So it's in our head, but brain mapping is very, very interesting science that we see different parts of the brain control different facets of our functioning, and so our thinking, is much more of a evolved system. People call OCD, a dysfunction of the reptilian brain because it's based on some of our most basic physiological instincts. It's like, the part of the brain that's responsible for waking us up or digesting food, is really located in the lower stem, which is, where most basic functioning exists, including our anxiety system.
Can I ask you a question about, speaking of choice? In the choice article, which again, it's all linked below. Anybody watching and listening, you have to read it. I mean, you have to read it multiple times. Reading it once is just not good enough, but I kind of feel that way about everything. You emphasize, Doc, that in the choice article that recovery is not about being helped, but it's about the patient making autonomous choices. Can you help the audience, Doc? What does that actually look like in a moment of intense anxiety and obsession, in a moment to choose relevance? Like, can you walk us through like a practical example of that?
Well, that would be defined, I guess, through exposure therapy. That when patients choose to mimic their brain's signal cognitively or behaviorally by touching dirty things or turning off the stove while engaging in a distractor task or lights and such, or the faucet. We're showing the brain that its signals are irrelevant and meaningless. So, and also by, a very important principle in recovery is, living our unaltered life path, which means, rather than ritualizing, or, in washing our hands, that we do the thing that we would ordinarily do if we didn't have OCD.
Symptom relief is not the goal. The goal is irrelevance. And so that is, to me, I wish that this was taught in every single school. I wish this was taught in every single institution of learning, because I think a lot of people have this that are just even afraid to talk about it, afraid to even mention it to anybody, and maybe just walking around suffering. You mentioned at the top of the hour, Doc, that this is the most debilitating, disorder a man, a woman, a human being can have. I'll never forget, before I found you, there was some thinking and some ideas I had in my head that, man, this is it for me. I mean, I'm losing my mind. I'm going crazy. I even had this crazy image of my mother visiting me through a partition sort of screen, and I'm in a straitjacket. I'll never forget that image. Created such horror and such intense physical anxiety. And because I tried to explain it like I did everything wrong.
Also, one of the biggest fallacies is this idea that people with OCD are crazy.
Yeah.
Because the brain is producing really crazy thoughts. My first introduction to it, as I mentioned, was a woman who, she was 36 years old. She was a professional, and she would drive around her neighborhood looking for bodies that she might have hit with her car. And then she would get to work and call the police station. Was there a hit and run in my neighborhood? She'd call emergency room hospitals. Did someone get admitted with a hit and run? And then she'd call ambulances. Did you pick up a body in this neighborhood from a hit and run? And she would spend about an hour at work just making all these phone calls basically every day until the cops stopped answering her. And when I first heard her speak, I thought, she's crazy. She sounded crazy, but I also knew that she wasn't, because she was so put together and spoke with such rational foundation. And so that's one of the biggest tragedies, is that people with OCD, who have these crazy associations, they're just brain material, and they're really not meaningful or relevant. Someone who sees things that aren't there or hears voices that aren't there, that's crazy. But people with OCD are not crazy. As I said, they just have an imbalance in their amygdala. Otherwise, they're completely, perfectly intact, functioning people.
Have you ever seen A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe,
Yeah.
Doc?
Uh-huh.
I'll never forget, because I think that movie came out right around the same time that I discovered you. And, he obviously had severe schizophrenia, and I would never conflate the two, OCD. But just going back to the idea of irrelevance, because I'll never forget at the end of the movie where he seemed to kind of still function. He became a professor, and I'll never forget his whatever the female lead was, or somebody was saying, how are you like able to function, or how are you able to do it? Are you still being ailed by these, schizophrenic episodes and these mirages? And he would say, yes, but if you just ignore them, I can deal with them a lot better.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I've mentioned exactly that final scene and that line, because
have they really?
Yeah, that's a huge part of the treatment of OCD. It's like, it's okay that your brain tells you to harm your child, or the brain tells you that you're going crazy or you're depressed. It's just important that you not engage with the themes of OCD.
Right.
One of the more difficult ones, it's funny because people have what's called existential OCD, where they'll sometimes have thoughts of that, like, what's the meaning of life? Like, why am I on this planet? And, many people find that very philosophically intriguing and compelling to kind of work out. But with OCD, it's a never-ending search for an answer that you can never really attain. And so sometimes spike themes mimic kind of real life, kind of mind challenges. On that note, I think we better start wrapping up.
One last thing. I have one last thing. Let's wrap it up. One last question. And I think this is a great way to end it. So, Doc, you've been doing this for 3 decades. You've treated thousands of people. What would you say? I think this is a perfect way to end this, and thank you. What is the single most important shift in understanding that you've seen in patients who ultimately recover?
Basically, the patients who say, I've done a lot of research, I've had a lot of treatment failures, I've read your material, and basically they say, I'm going to do everything that you tell me. So treatment compliance is...
You just named me.
Yeah. Treatment compliance is really the essential foundation for success. OCD can be very manipulative because, a person, really believes that their goal is to not have thoughts of harming their child. And it's really difficult to kind of get through that. That's not a problem at all, that's just natural brain activity. So, someone who really absorbs the principles of the condition and engages in the treatment, the behavioral treatment, in a very, very aggressive way. And that, is also a profound antidepressant for a patient to see, week after week progress, and they take back more and more of their life, and they see that they have the agency to achieve that goal. So definitely treatment compliance is the most important part of effectiveness of treatment.
And treatment compliance, just to kind of unpack that for a second, would denote communicating irrelevance to the condition. That's the key. Having the symptoms, having anxiety, having the physical sensations, having the thoughts is not the issue, is not the problem. It's the relationship to those that is the problem. Is that a good way of kind of defining treatment compliance simplistically, Doc?
Yep. Very much.
Okay. Well, hey, I just want to say thank you so much. Please tap that thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you share these. I'm telling you, these videos are treasures. This information is the best information that you're going to get. This is not hyperbole. This is the best information you're going to get. And I will leave Doc's information too to reach out. He has an amazing practice. I highly recommend everybody, if you feel that this is something that you have or you could benefit from this, go check him out. I will leave all his contact information. Doc, thank you so much, and we'll see you very soon, everybody.
Thank you very much.